Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we've got two guests with us. They are co-authors of a book called If We Are Striking for Pennsylvania. I'd like to welcome to the show for the first time, Eric Wittenberg. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Absolutely welcome. And then returning for second or third time?
Third, I think.
Third, I think so too. Yeah. Scott Mingus is with us again.
Thanks,
so
Matt.
Thank you guys for coming on. So this book here, what's interesting about it is that you don't even talk about the battle.
No, we actually end the story the night before the battle begins.
Right, which is good because I don't know. I always focused on the 3 days of the battle.
Most people do.
Yeah, I usually, like, if I would get a book that was a comprehensive study or whatever, I would always kind of just skip through and then get to the battle, right? Because that's what I want to learn about. But as I get older, as I got more into this, and when I started doing the show, I became more fascinated with the lead up to the battle. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't say I could, recite it all chapter and verse and date by date, but I still find it very interesting. In the book, according to the description on Amazon, it says it integrates military, media, political, social, economic, and civilian perspectives. Right?
That is absolutely true.
Right. So how many pages is this book?
Well, there's two volumes.
Yeah, 2 volumes, okay.
And when you put them together, it's about 930 pages.
Okay.
Right.
So this is a pretty solid, big
and there's plenty
here.
of stuff we left out.
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
But yeah,
in the interest of length control.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, one of the things we wanted to do was really focus on the days before the battle, particularly the 3 weeks and the lead up to it, because as you know, there's 1,000 books. Eric and I have did probably 18 to 19 between us on the Battle of Gettysburg itself or some aspect of it. But it's that lead up, what was going on. And there have been some books written on the campaign as well, but not with the integration that we wanted. To your point, Matt, we were talking about, we wanted to look at the political side, what was happening in Richmond, what was happening in Washington, how the media respond. One of the things we tapped into that I don't think anybody's ever really looked at to any great degree was the international press. What was happening in England, what was happening in France.
Yeah, and that's important because Lee was hoping to get their attention.
Yeah, exactly. It was one of the key chief goals of the campaign, and it just kind of surprised both of us that nobody had ever really looked at that in any kind of depth.
And the stuff's available because you've got these digitized databases and newspapers.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a gold mine just waiting for somebody to come and dig through it.
So what were they saying in England and France?
Well, to make a long story short, in England, a lot of the business people and the nobility were pretty much rooting for the South in a lot of ways. The middle class seemed to be more for the North, and a lot of the working people who were anti-government tended to be for the South as well. So if you added it all up, there was a lot more pro-Confederate, if you will, than pro-North sentiment. And one of the things we talk about in the book as well is the pressure that was being put on Parliament from a lot of, again, the nobility in particular about, we don't want to see the South lose.
Right.
We'd like to see them succeed in this particular case. So it was fascinating. And then the same thing was going on in France where Napoleon III was getting significant pressure. He had forces in Mexico at that point in time.
Sure.
So he had a strong interest in North America anyway. And so there were a lot of people there wanting to see what France's reaction was going to be.
There was also some stuff in Ireland that Scott dug up. And of course, Ireland was in the process of moving toward its own revolutionary type of a scenario to split Ireland off from the UK. So there was a lot of interest in it over there. Scott found some interesting articles about it.
Yeah.
So we have a listener in Ireland, and we have a few, but one that I'm in touch with on a semi-regular basis. And I asked him, because I'm always curious when foreigners are interested in our Civil War or our history in any way, but especially the Civil War. And so I asked him, what is your interest in the Civil War? And he said, well, the village I live in, it's called Points Pass, I think. It's small little village, but his grandmother had told him a story about a priest who, when the war broke out, and all the Irish boys were fighting over here and everything, he went over to tend to them spiritually, and then when the war was done, he came back, and that was enough to get him interested, and he looked into it, and So, do you know what was the interest in Ireland? Like, I mean, obviously there was some interest, but like, were they more pro-North or pro-South?
No, they were definitely pro-Confederate.
Yeah.
Because they were having the same kind of breakaway stuff going on in Ireland, too.
Yeah, okay. So then what about other countries in Europe? Did you get into any of that?
Not in any great detail. Number one, I don't speak the language or read the language. So.
And I don't either.
So I was pretty much doing internet searches for English language newspapers, none of which existed in Germany, for example.
Right.
But having spent a lot of time in Germany, 4 to 5 trips a year for 20 years, the Germans tended to be more ambivalent. For example, they had their own problems because they just you had the
1848.
Yeah, exactly. So they tended to want to kind of take a wait and see attitude. Plus, they didn't have the economic interests that France and England had because of the trade with the United States and the international shipping that was going on, which there was some with Germany, but not nearly to the extent. Mm-hmm. So they were really less connected to the United States than the other countries that were more aligned with. Even though there were still probably plenty of German immigrants in the United States and a lot of people were coming here, one of the things that I found and it's not in the book, but I talk about it with a lot of my friends in Germany, is that the fact that most of their interest was more on a personal than a political level. How was Johann doing in the regiment? Have you heard from Wilhelm? Or isn't it a shame that so and so was shot and killed? So it was a lot of personal stuff.
Okay,
much more than the politics. The politics were much bigger in England.
And most of at least at the higher level of command, most of the Germans were refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848.
Right.
Exactly.
So they got out of Dodge because they were going to end up with a noose around their neck.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
So there's that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was at the CWI in June and heard a lecture about Lee and Jackson, and it was Christian Keller gave the lecture, and he said that
and he's terrific.
He's great. I thought he was fantastic, and he has his own podcast too. Do you ever listen to it?
I do once in a while.
I find it very interesting.
And Chris is a good guy too.
Yeah, he is. And so he was saying that Jackson and Lee planned what would ultimately be the Gettysburg campaign prior to Chancellorsville. Have you heard that?
Yeah,
right?
one of the stories I've heard over the years is that Jackson called in Alexander Boteler, who was a staff officer, an ordnance officer, I'm not mistaken, a major, who happened to be a Confederate congressman. And he told him famously that if you can authorize, or if you'll give me 36,000 men, I will take the war to the banks of the Susquehanna. Now, this is before Jackson was involved with Lee. He was still doing his own thing in the Shenandoah Valley at that point in time. Never got his troops, never got that authorization to head towards the Susquehanna, i.e. Harrisburg or York or Carlisle or wherever. But it was his idea that percolated with Alexander Boteler that when Joseph Johnston was shot, Lee takes over, Jackson starts telling Lee about the Pennsylvania idea, and that germinates into what becomes the Northern Virginia campaign, followed by the Maryland campaign that leads him to come here to Pennsylvania. So,
right.
I think that we have Boteler's account of what happened. We have Jackson's account through a couple other people. So I think it's entirely possible that's where the whole thing started.
And certainly Lee wanted to take the war out of Northern Virginia.
No doubt.
For sure.
Yeah.
No doubt.
That was a big deal.
There were a lot of reasons for it. Jackson, though, I believe he was really intent on attacking like mines and, really going after the North's economic ability and, all other abilities, I guess, fuel and all that other stuff, which, I never really, I guess it makes sense, but I never really heard. You don't hear that a lot,
There's a book by James Cagle called North with Lee and Jackson, And in that, he postulates that one of Jackson's goals was the anthracite coal mines, which were north of Harrisburg. And
Right.
the reason being, of course, and my dad was a coal miner, so I know a little bit about this, anthracite coal burns with far less smoke than bituminous coal does. And these mines here in Pennsylvania were, at least that part of Pennsylvania, north of Harrisburg, were mostly anthracite. And so the U.S. Navy was using anthracite coal for the blockade, where the Confederate blockade runners were coming in with either peat moss or heavily bituminous coal that would be an oily black smoke. And so the thought was, at least according to James Cagle, this author of this book, Jackson's idea was to knock off those coal mines, which would help alleviate the blockade.
Right. And it might have to force them to use smoke that would be visible from further away.
Or
Is that
something
kind
like
of
that.
the thinking? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. That's clever. Yeah. See, you never think, you always just think of these generals as guys on battlefields, but they're far more than that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you can't be an idiot and be a commanding general at the Jackson or Lee level.
Sure.
That's absolutely true.
So,
And if you are an idiot, you won't last long.
that's true. Yes.
See Daniel Sickles.
Yeah. Right. Great point.
Irwin McDowell.
So, all right. So then, let's get into all the different things here. So we've got military. We cover that a lot on everything. So I'd like to get a little further away from that because I think some of these other things are interesting here. Media. We talked about newspapers in other countries.
We also, in the book, we heavily focus on a lot of the U.S. papers as well.
Right.
What's the reaction in the major cities, Philadelphia, New York, et cetera. But one of the things
Now, when you say reaction to which? What,
to the invasion.
To the invasion. So
In
the
the
invasion's underway
Right.
at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, or being planned. But we also looked at the Richmond papers, things like that. But one of the things we wanted to really focus on were the small town newspapers. You know, what were the people in Waynesboro experiencing, for example,
Yeah,
in southern
yeah.
Pennsylvania? What about Winchester? You mentioned that earlier. What about all these small little communities? You know, I live in York. You know, how did our paper react? And it was interesting because you study through that, you start realizing that the people were scared to death.
Sure.
Nobody knew what was happening. And the hardest thing I think for Eric and I to do was to write this book without trying to put ourselves in the book. You know, because we tend to
Yes.
know what happened.
Right.
And we wanted to create, I don't know how you say it, suspense maybe?
Yeah. Yeah.
To try
okay.
to make the book readable to the point where the reader really
wants to keep going.
wants to keep going
Yeah.
because they really don't, even though they know what's going to happen, they don't in some ways. And we wanted to try to capture that aura of, of uncertainty or the expectancy of what's going to happen next. Because you got to realize these people had no clue.
Yeah.
You know, are they coming? You know, in the early days, are they coming to Pennsylvania or not? I mean, they've been hearing "Here Come the Rebels" for years,
Right.
and now is it Chicken Little or are they really coming?
Well, that's the interesting thing about, if you study Gettysburg, and I'm sure it's similar in other towns along the border. You've been hearing that since the start of the war.
Yeah.
The rebels are coming,
Sure.
and then they never show up. And then finally, here it is. And
Wolf enough time.
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't really believe it around here until the people from Chambersburg started flooding in, saying, "No, they're coming."
Exactly. I mean, I live in York County, and we have newspaper clippings from April of 1861. April of 61, right after Fort Sumter, where there's rumors in the Hanover newspaper that the Baltimore rowdies are going to come to and burn Hanover, Pennsylvania to the ground. This is late April 1861, and they're already fearing a Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania.
And doesn't that spread over to here and cause a little bit of a panic?
Absolutely.
Was it the Pug Uglies or Plug Uglies?
Plug Uglies.
Plug.
Yeah, Plug Uglies.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the fall of 62, after Antietam, Stuart leads a raid into Pennsylvania that goes through Mercersburg, Chambersburg, and passed between Cashtown and Gettysburg. So that created all kinds of havoc and panic around here as well.
Right. Just a quick aside. So you both wrote this together, and you were saying before you were trying to figure out like how we want to do this without putting ourselves in it. But you're both individually accomplished authors. Mm-hmm. So how do two accomplished authors who, and I don't say this in a negative way, but you have your own egos that, come with it, how do you put that aside to create basically what would, I guess, essentially be a new style because it's a blending of your two styles? Like, how do you do that without button heads?
I'll take that one.
Sure.
Okay.
About 15 years ago, I approached Scott and said, let's do a book on 2nd Winchester together.
Oh, okay.
And we ended up writing that book. And I knew from prior experience that Scott's writing style and his approach to telling history is very similar to mine.
Okay. So that helps.
It helps a lot.
Yeah.
In that we both believe in letting the soldiers tell their own stories.
Good. Okay.
So it was a function.
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.